She was as beautiful as a woman could be, and she carried herself with the confidence of someone who knew it well. The church seemed to revolve around her. The women admired her elegance and praised her for her grace and generosity. The men were captivated by her beauty, but it was her sharp wit and resourcefulness that left a deeper impression. The youth looked up to her, inspired by the effortless charm she seemed to exude. And the pastor? He was utterly in love with her. But what they all saw was nothing more than a carefully crafted illusion. Beneath the radiant smile and polished exterior lurked a far darker truth. She was no saint. She was a predator in disguise, a wolf among the sheep. The sun cast its golden rays over the small, beautiful town of Everfield, where life revolved around the church at its heart. Inside, Pastor Elijah Matthews stood at the pulpit, his voice steady and impassioned as he delivered the morning sermon. His words carried the weight of a man who had walked through fire and come out refined, each sentence a testament to his long, arduous journey of redemption. Elijah had not always been the man he was now. Years ago, he had been a different person, a man consumed by worldly desires and reckless indulgence. But that life felt like a distant memory, buried beneath layers of repentance, study, and unwavering faith. He had built a new life here in Everfield, where he was respected, even revered by the congregation he had come to see as his family. Here, he believed, he was safe from the shadows of his past. This illusion shattered the moment she walked into the sanctuary. It was a Sunday like any other, the congregation abuzz with the mingling of familiar faces and the occasional newcomer. Elijah was greeting parishioners at the church door when he first saw her. She stepped out of a sleek black car, her movements graceful yet deliberate, her presence commanding attention without effort. She wore a beautiful dress, modest enough for church, but fitted in a way that hinted at the figure beneath. Her hair, in the all-familiar cornrows that were her signature, framing a face that was impossible to forget. Delilah. His breath caught in his throat, and for a moment, the noise of the congregation faded into a dull hum. It had been over a decade since he'd last seen her, but the memories came rushing back as if no time had passed at all. Her laughter, her touch, the nights of passion that had defined their turbulent relationship, and the heartbreak when it all fell apart. "Pastor?" The voice of Mrs. Burrows, an elderly member of the congregation, snapped him back to the present. She smiled up at him, her weathered face radiating warmth. Elijah managed a polite nod, shaking her hand before turning his attention back to the newcomer. Delilah had already made her way into the sanctuary, her head held high, her eyes scanning the room as if she belonged there. He spent the next hour delivering a sermon he could hardly remember. His words felt mechanical, his usual fervor replaced by a gnawing tension that he struggled to suppress. As he spoke, his eyes flickered to where she sat, third pew from the front, her gaze fixed on him with an intensity that made his pulse quicken. After the service, Elijah retreated to his office, his sanctuary within the sanctuary. He closed the door and leaned against it, his mind racing. Why was she here? What did she want? And how had she found him after all these years? A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. Before he could answer, the door creaked open, and there she was, standing in the doorway with a faint smile that sent a shiver down his spine. "Hello, Elijah," she said, her voice as smooth and captivating as he remembered. "It's been a long time." He straightened, his pastoral demeanor slipping back into place like armor. "Delilah, what brings—" "You here?" She stepped inside, closing the door behind her. "I needed a fresh start. And when I heard you were here, I thought—" She paused, her eyes searching his. "Well, maybe this is where I'm meant to be." Elijah's jaw tightened. He had spent years burying the man he once was, the man who had loved Delilah with a reckless abandon that nearly destroyed him. And now, here she was, threatening to unearth everything he had worked so hard to leave behind. "You're welcome here, as is anyone," he said, his voice measured. "But if you've come looking for the man I used to be, you won't find him." Delilah's smile widened, a hint of challenge in her eyes. "We'll see about that." As she turned and walked out, Elijah sank into his chair, his heart pounding. The past he thought he had escaped had found him, and he knew deep down that his faith was about to be tested in ways he had never imagined. Elijah Matthews sat on the porch swing of his modest home that evening. His wife Grace emerged from the house carrying a tray of iced tea and set it on the small table beside him. "It's a beautiful day," Grace said, her smile warm as she joined him on the swing. "It's moments like this that make all the hard work worth it." Elijah nodded, his gaze fixed on the tray she was carrying but his mind elsewhere. Grace had always been his anchor, the woman who believed in him even when he couldn't believe in himself. She was perceptive, too, a quality that had both comforted and unsettled him over the years. "You've been quiet today," she observed, breaking the silence. "Is something on your mind?" He hesitated, forcing a smile. "Just tired, that's all." "It was a long day at church," Grace nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I noticed someone new at the service this morning. Third pew, beautiful cornrows. She seemed familiar." Elijah's chest tightened. "Oh? I didn't notice," he said quickly, his tone too casual. Grace's eyes lingered on him, her brow furrowing slightly. Grace said nothing, her silence more telling than words. She picked up her glass of iced tea and took a sip, her gaze shifting to the neighbor's children playing in the yard. Elijah let out a breath, hoping the subject had been dropped. But just as relief began to settle over him, his phone buzzed. On the table. He glanced at the screen, his stomach dropping when he saw the name. Delilah. How? You mean after all this time he had not deleted her number? Grace's eyes flickered to the phone, and though she said nothing, her lips pressed into a thin line. Elijah picked up the phone, his pulse pounding as he read the message. "We need to talk." The past he thought he had left behind was no longer at the door. It had walked right into his home. Grace Matthews was a woman of quiet strength and unwavering faith. As she watched her husband rise from the porch swing, phone in hand and tension etched into his every movement, she felt a knot tighten in her stomach. Something was wrong. She didn't need him to say it. She could see it in his evasive answers, in the way his gaze shifted when the name appeared on his phone. Who was Delilah? She wondered. Elijah, she called softly as he turned to head inside. He paused, looking back at her. Yes? Is everything all right? He hesitated, the weight of her question evident in his posture. It's fine, Grace. Just a church matter I need to attend to. She nodded, though her heart whispered otherwise. All right, she said, her voice gentle. Be safe. As Elijah disappeared into the house, Grace bowed her head, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She closed her eyes and began to pray. Lord, I don't know what's happening, but I trust you. If there's something hidden in the darkness, bring it to light. Protect my family and guide Elijah in your truth. Amen. Inside, Elijah paced the length of their bedroom, Delilah's message burning a hole in his mind. He had no intention of telling Grace the truth, not because he didn't trust her, but because he couldn't bear to see the disappointment in her eyes. She had been his rock, the person who saw potential in him when he saw only failure. He typed a reply. Where and when? Almost immediately, her response came. Tomorrow, 7 p.m. The cafe near Gus. The park. Don't be late. Elijah clenched his jaw, his heart pounding. What did she want? Why now? As he prepared for bed, he told himself it was just a meeting, that he would handle it professionally and put an end to whatever Delilah had in mind. But deep down, he knew it wouldn't be that simple. The next evening, Elijah found himself standing outside the cafe, his heart heavy with dread. The bustling sounds of life around him felt distant, as though he were trapped in a bubble of his own turmoil. He spotted Delilah seated at a corner table by the window, her striking features softened by the warm glow of the cafe lights. Taking a deep breath, he stepped inside. Delilah looked up and smiled, her expression a mixture of familiarity and something unspoken. "Elijah," she greeted, her voice smooth and inviting. "I wasn't sure you'd come." "I'm here," he said, taking the seat across from her. "What do you want, Delilah?" Her smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. Straight to the point. "I've always admired that about you." "This isn't a social call," he replied firmly. "If you have something to say, say it." She leaned back in her chair, her eyes narrowing slightly. "I need help. I've made some mistakes, and I think you're the only one who can help me make them right." Elijah frowned. "What kind of mistakes?" Delilah hesitated, her confident facade cracking ever so slightly. "Let's just say I've burned some bridges and now I'm looking for redemption. And who better to guide me than a man who's been through it himself?" Elijah's jaw tightened. He didn't trust her, not her words, not her intentions. But a small part of him, the part that still remembered the woman he once loved, felt a twinge of sympathy. "I'll help you," he said cautiously, "but only on my terms. If you're looking for spiritual guidance, I'll provide it, but that's as far as it goes." Delilah's expression softened, and for a moment she looked almost vulnerable. "Thank you, Elijah. I knew I could count on you." As he left the cafe that night, Elijah couldn't shake the feeling that he had just stepped onto a path he wasn't prepared to walk. Little did he know, Grace was at home, kneeling beside their bed, praying fervently for strength and wisdom, for both of them. Elijah sat in his dimly lit office at the church, his head bowed and hands clasped tightly together. It had been a long day filled with meetings, phone calls, and a gnawing unease that refused to leave him. The events of the previous evening lingered in his mind, and he found himself questioning whether he had made the right decision in agreeing to meet Delilah. The phone on his desk buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. The screen lit up with her name. He hesitated for a moment before picking up. "Elijah," Delilah's voice came through the line, smooth and measured. "Delilah," he replied, his tone guarded. "I wasn't expecting to hear from you so soon." "I couldn't wait," she said. "There's something I need to tell you. Something important." Elijah leaned back in his chair, bracing himself. "I'm listening." She hesitated, and for a moment, he thought she might change her mind. But then she sighed, her voice softening. "I've been through a lot, Elijah, more than you can imagine. My marriage, it's over. The divorce was finalized last month. It was messy and painful." Elijah felt a pang of sympathy despite himself. "I'm sorry to hear that." "Don't be," she said quickly. "It needed to happen, but now I'm at a crossroads. I've left everything behind and I need to rebuild. I've been thinking, and I want to stay here for a while." Elijah stiffened. "Here? In Everfield?" "Yes," she said. "It's quiet. It's peaceful. It feels like the kind of place where I can start over. I have the money to get by, but I need help. I need someone I can trust to help me find my footing." He rubbed his temple, his mind racing. "Delilah, this town is small. People will talk. It's not the kind of place where you can just blend in, especially given our history." "I don't care about the gossip," she said firmly. "I'm not asking you to risk your reputation for me, Elijah. I just need guidance, help finding a place to stay, maybe connecting with people who can help me settle in." Elijah was silent for a moment, torn between his instincts to protect himself and his family and his calling as a pastor to help those in need. Finally, he said, "I'll think about it. But this has to be strictly professional, Delilah. I need to make that clear." "Of course," she said, though there was an edge of amusement in her voice. "Thank you, Elijah. I knew you'd understand." As the call ended, Elijah stared at the phone in his hand, a heavy weight settling in his chest. He knew that helping Delilah would complicate his life in ways he couldn't yet foresee, but walking away felt equally impossible. At home, Grace knelt beside the bed, her hands clasped tightly as she prayed. She didn't know the specifics, but she felt the storm brewing. "Lord, whatever this is, give Elijah the wisdom to see the truth and the strength to do what is right," she whispered, "and give me the grace to stand by him no matter what comes." Unbeknownst to both of them, this decision would set in motion events that would test their faith, their love, and their resolve in ways they had never imagined. Delilah stared out, the window of her rented apartment, her reflection a shadowy figure in the glass. Below, the quiet streets of Everfield glowed under the soft light of the street lamps, the serenity a stark contrast to the storm raging within her. She sipped a glass of wine, her thoughts drifting to the man she had spent years trying and failing to forget. Elijah. She had tried to move on. She had married a man who adored her, who gave her the financial security and social status she had always thought she wanted. But no amount of luxury, no grand house or exotic vacation could fill the void Elijah had left in her heart. Her marriage had been a performance, a hollow attempt to erase the past, but deep down she knew the truth. She didn't want to forget Elijah. Oh, why did she leave Elijah? The money and the security Hudson, her husband, had provided seemed a good reason at the time, but not anymore. When the marriage finally crumbled under the weight of her discontent, Delilah didn't feel the sorrow she thought she would. Instead, she felt a twisted sense of relief, an acknowledgement that she could now face the truth she had been running from. She wanted Elijah back, but not the broken man she had walked away from years ago. She had been so cruel, driven by her love for Hudson's wealth. It had devastated him. But the new Elijah she found at Everfield was different, stronger, wiser, untouchable in his sanctified role as pastor. His new life didn't intimidate. It intrigued her, ignited a challenge she couldn't resist. Delilah's lips curved into a slow smile as she thought of the way he had looked at her last Sunday. He had tried to mask it, but she had seen the flicker of recognition, the hesitation, the way his voice faltered in his sermon. He still felt something for her, no matter how deeply he had buried it, and she would unearth it. Her plan was simple, yet intricate. She would start by becoming a part of his world, blend into the congregation, win over the parishioners, and find subtle ways to remind him of what they had shared. She would be patient, calculated, a steady presence in his life until the walls he had built around himself began to crumble. The text she sent earlier was just the beginning. She needed to plant seeds of familiarity, force him to confront the emotions he had worked so hard to suppress. When he agreed to meet her, she would start slow, presenting herself as someone seeking guidance, a soul in need of redemption. What Elijah didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that Delilah's need for redemption was rooted in her desire for him. She had no intention of walking away this time. She set her glass down and picked up her phone, her fingers hovering over the screen. Finally, she typed a message. "Thank you for agreeing to help. You've always been the kind of man people can rely on. I'll see you tomorrow." She hit send and leaned back in her chair, her mind buzzing with possibilities. Elijah Matthews might have built a new life, but Delilah was determined to become a part of it, no matter what it took. Elijah slipped on his jacket, his mind heavy, with the weight of the upcoming meeting. He told himself it was just another pastoral duty, a simple act of kindness for someone in need. But the unease gnawing at him suggested otherwise. Grace watched him from the kitchen doorway, her arms crossed, and her expression unreadable. She had noticed the change in him, how he had become quieter, more distracted since Delilah's arrival. She hadn't pressed him, but her intuition told her that the woman in the third pew was more than just another newcomer. "Elijah," she said softly, breaking the silence. He turned to her, startled. "Yes?" "Be careful," she said, her voice steady, but laced with an undercurrent of emotion. "Whatever this is, whoever she is, remember what's at stake." Her words hit him like a hammer, but he nodded, unable to meet her gaze. "I will," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. As he walked out the door, Grace sank to her knees, tears streaming down her face. She didn't know what Delilah wanted, but she could feel the tension pulling at her family, threatening to unravel everything they had built. In her heart, she prayed for Elijah's strength. But a part of her also prayed for the courage to face whatever truth lay ahead. The church's fellowship hall buzzed with chatter and laughter as the women of Everfield's congregation gathered for their monthly meeting. The January sun streamed through the stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns on the polished wooden floor. Grace Matthews, the women's leader, stood at the front of the room, her calm demeanor concealing the unease that had lingered since Elijah's late night meeting with Delilah. Today's meeting was crucial. They were finalizing plans for the year's women-led projects. For months, the group had struggled to secure funds for a few key initiatives, including a community outreach program and a scholarship fund for underprivileged girls. Grace had prayed fervently for a breakthrough, hoping that this year would bring answers. As the women settled into their seats, Delilah walked in, her entrance commanding attention without effort. She wore a red dress, modest yet elegant, and carried herself with a grace that seemed almost calculated. Grace felt her stomach tighten as the room collectively turned to acknowledge the newcomer. "Good morning, everyone," Delilah said, her smile warm and disarming. "I hope I'm not intruding. I heard about the meeting and thought I'd join. It's such a blessing to see women coming together for a greater cause." The group welcomed her enthusiastically, curious yet charmed by her poise and polished demeanor. Grace forced a smile, her role as leader compelling her to set aside personal feelings for the sake of unity. "Of course you're welcome, Delilah," Grace said, her voice steady but guarded. "We're always happy to have more hands and hearts involved." As the meeting progressed, Delilah seamlessly inserted herself into the discussions, her contributions thoughtful and engaging. She listened intently as the women shared updates on the year's projects, nodding with genuine interest and occasionally offering suggestions that were both practical and insightful. The room, including Grace, couldn't help but be drawn to her. When the topic shifted to the financial struggles hindering their plans, Delilah leaned forward, her eyes sparkling with purpose. "It's disheartening to hear about these roadblocks," she said, her tone sympathetic. "But I believe every dream deserves a chance to flourish. I'd like to help." The room fell silent, the women exchanging glances of surprise and curiosity. Delilah continued, her voice steady but filled with conviction. "I recently came into some funds from the sale of a property, and I've been praying for the right way to use it. If it's all right with you, I'd like to cover the costs for the scholarship fund and the community outreach program." A collective gasp rippled through the group. Grace, momentarily stunned, struggled to find her words. "That's incredibly generous," she finally said, her eyes searching Delilah's for any hint of ulterior motive. "Are you sure? Those are significant contributions," Delilah smiled, her expression serene. "I'm certain. God has been good to me, and I want to pay it forward. Besides, what better way to start the year than by empowering women and helping the community?" The room erupted into applause and murmurs of gratitude. Several women approached Delilah after the meeting to thank her personally, their admiration for her evident. Grace watched from a distance, her emotions a tangled web of skepticism and guilt. Delilah had been nothing but gracious, her actions selfless, and her demeanor impeccable. Yet Grace couldn't shake the feeling that this generosity was part of something deeper, something calculated. As the meeting ended and the women began to disperse, Delilah approached Grace, her smile radiant. "Thank you for welcoming me," Delilah said, her voice as smooth as honey. "You've built something truly beautiful here." "I'm honored to be part of it." Grace forced herself to smile, her mind racing. "We're grateful for your support," she replied, her tone measured. "Your contributions will make a real difference." Delilah placed a hand on Grace's arm, her touch light but firm. "It's not just about the money," she said, her eyes locking onto Grace's. "It's about building relationships, isn't it? I hope we can become good friends, Grace. You strike me as someone worth knowing." Grace nodded, her face a mask of composure. "Friendship is always welcome in the house of God." As Delilah walked away, Grace's heart sank. The other women were captivated by her, and even Grace had to admit she was impressive. But beneath the surface, Grace felt the stirrings of a battle, a spiritual one. Later that evening, as she knelt, in prayer, Grace poured out her concerns to God. "Lord, I don't know her true intentions, but you do," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "If this is a test, give me the wisdom to discern and the strength to protect my family and my church." Grace knew she was facing something far more dangerous than she had anticipated. Delilah wasn't just a newcomer. She was a force of nature, one with the power to charm, disrupt, and potentially destroy. The Matthews household was unusually quiet that evening. Grace sat at the dining table, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of tea. Elijah entered, loosening his tie, his expression weary from another long day at the church. "How was the women's meeting?" he asked, sitting down across from her and reaching for the jug of water. Grace hesitated, her eyes scanning his face. "It was good, productive. We made significant progress with our plans for the year." Elijah glanced up, sensing the weight in her voice. "But?" She took a deep breath, her fingers tightening around her cup. Delilah was there. Elijah froze, the glass halfway to his lips. "Delilah? At the women's meeting?" Grace nodded, her expression cautious. She was gracious, generous even. She offered to fund the scholarship program and the community outreach project. It was a gesture no one could ignore. Elijah set the glass down, his heart sinking. He knew Delilah's charm. It was one of her most dangerous weapons. If she had already begun to win over the women of the church, it was only a matter of time before her influence spread further. "It looks like she's trying to ingratiate herself," Grace added quietly, watching his reaction. "Elijah, something about this feels calculated." Elijah rubbed his temples, his mind racing. "I'll talk to her," he said after a long pause. Grace nodded, relief and concern warring on her face. Later that night, Elijah stepped onto the back porch, his phone in hand. The night air was cool, and the crickets chirped in the distance. He dialed Delilah's number, his stomach churning. She picked up on the second ring. "Elijah," she said, her voice soft and familiar, tinged with what sounded like relief. "I was hoping you'd call." "We need to talk," he said, his tone firm. "What's wrong?" she asked, a note of concern in her voice. "I heard about your involvement at the women's meeting," he said. "I think it's best if you keep a lower profile. This congregation is about community, not personal agendas." There was a pause, and then a soft sob on the other end of the line. "I don't understand," Delilah said, her voice breaking. "I was only trying to help. This community welcomed me when I felt so lost. I wanted to give back. Is that so wrong?" Elijah's resolve wavered. He could almost see her, tears streaming down her face, her vulnerability laid bare. His soft heart ached, and he struggled to hold his ground. "Delilah, it's not about your generosity," he said, his tone softening. "It's about the perception. People talk." "I've only ever admired you, Elijah," she interrupted, her voice trembling. "You were my light in the darkest times. I thought maybe I could finally find peace here, but if I've overstepped..." Elijah sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's not about overstepping. Just be cautious. That's all." There was a long silence, and then she whispered, "Thank you for understanding." When the call ended, Elijah leaned against the porch railing, a sinking feeling settling in his chest. He knew he had just let his guard down, and the consequences would be far-reaching. Over the next few weeks, Delilah's influence grew. Her generosity didn't stop at the women's group. She began funding other church initiatives, quickly earning the admiration of the elders. "She has a heart for service," one elder remarked during a board meeting, "and the resources to make things happen. We could use someone like her on the church board." Elijah stiffened. "That's a big decision," he said carefully. "We should pray on it before moving forward." But the elders, swayed by their wives' glowing reports and Delilah's tangible contributions, were eager to act. By the end of the week, Delilah was officially invited to join the board. Unknown to them, this was exactly what Delilah wanted. She attended every meeting with enthusiasm, her presence poised yet commanding. She charmed the elders, offered solutions to every problem, and proposed late-night meetings to accommodate busier schedules. Her motives, however, were far from pure. Delilah's goal was clear: to remain close to Elijah and break through his defenses. She dressed modestly but attractively, her every gesture and word designed to remind him of what they once shared. Elijah's turmoil deepened. He saw the storm gathering, the potential for ruin looming closer with every interaction. Yet he couldn't find a way to extricate himself from the web Delilah was weaving. Grace, ever perceptive, watched the changes in her husband with a heavy heart. She sensed the tension in his shoulders, the distant look in his eyes. She doubled down on her prayers, crying out to God for wisdom and protection. But Delilah was relentless, and the battle for Elijah's heart and soul had only just begun. It was another crisp evening in Everfield, and the church board meeting had just concluded. The members filtered out one by one, their discussions about the upcoming projects leaving them in high spirits. Delilah lingered behind, her usual graceful composure captivating even in the dim lighting of the church hall. Deacon Robert, a widower, in his early 50s and a respected member of the congregation, approached her as she gathered her notes. He was a man of quiet strength, his recent loss still evident in the weariness around his eyes. Yet there was a flicker of hope in his demeanor as he spoke. "Delilah," Robert began, his voice kind but steady, "I hope you don't mind me saying this, but I've come to admire your dedication and your heart for the church. You're a remarkable woman." Delilah's brows arched slightly, her expression a mixture of curiosity and politeness. "Thank you, Deacon Robert. That means a lot, coming from you." He hesitated for a moment, then pressed on. "I know it hasn't been long since we've gotten to know each other, but I'd like the opportunity to court you properly, if that's something you'd consider." Delilah's smile didn't falter, but there was a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. "I appreciate your kind words truly, but I need some time to think and pray about it. I hope you'll understand." Robert nodded, his respect for her unwavering. "Of course. Take all the time you need." The next day, Robert sought out Pastor Elijah to inform him of his intentions. They met in Elijah's office, where the younger man listened intently, his hands clasped on the desk. "I believe Delilah is a wonderful woman," Robert said earnestly. "She's kind, thoughtful, and has such a strong presence. I want to approach this honorably, which is why I'm coming to you first." Elijah smiled, masking the unease churning inside him. "Robert, your heart and intentions are admirable. Delilah is indeed a remarkable woman, and if this is God's will, I'm sure he will guide you both." Robert left the office encouraged, but Elijah couldn't shake the sinking feeling that Delilah had no intentions of reciprocating. Later that evening, Elijah called Delilah. He had resolved to encourage her to consider Robert seriously, hoping it might help redirect her focus and ease the growing tension in his own heart. "Delilah," he began, his tone measured, "I wanted to speak to you about Deacon Robert. He's a good man, kind, wise, and devoted to his faith. If you're open to it, I believe he could be a wonderful partner for you." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line, followed by a soft laugh that sent a shiver down Elijah's spine. "Elijah," she said, her voice smooth but with an unmistakable edge, "I respect Deacon Robert, but let me make one thing clear. The man I want isn't him." Elijah's breath hitched. "Delilah, I don't think I'm following." "Oh, but you are," she said, her tone dropping to a sultry whisper. "It's you, Elijah. You're the man I want." His heart thundered in his chest, a mix of anger, fear, and something he didn't dare name. "Delilah, I'm a married man. What you're saying is not good at all." "Don't say it's wrong," she interrupted, her voice firm yet enticing. "You can't deny the connection we've always had. You think I don't see it? The way you look at me? The hesitation in your voice when you speak to me? Being someone else's husband doesn't erase what we had, or what we could still have. Elijah stood, pacing his office, his hand trembling as he gripped the phone. "You've crossed a line, Delilah," he said, his voice barely steady. "I've worked hard to build a life of integrity, a life that honors God and my family. Whatever you think you see, it ends here." But Delilah wasn't deterred. "You can lie to yourself, Elijah, but you can't lie to me. I've tried to move on, gotten married, built a life. But no one ever compared to you. And I'm not leaving this town until you realize it." The call ended, and Elijah collapsed into his chair, his head in his hands. The storm he had feared was no longer on the horizon, was here, threatening to consume everything he held dear. Meanwhile, Delilah sat in her lavish home, a sly smile playing on her lips. She knew she had planted a seed of doubt, a seed she was determined to nurture. The game had begun, and she had every intention of winning. The afternoon sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows of the church, casting colorful patterns across the walls of Elijah's office. He sat at his desk poring over the upcoming sermon notes, but his mind was elsewhere. The weight of Delilah's words from their last conversation hung over him like a storm cloud. A knock at the door snapped him out of his thoughts. He glanced. At his watch, visitors were rare this time of day. "Come in," he said, trying to steady his voice. The door opened, and there she was. Delilah, poised and composed, with an air of vulnerability that felt out of place given the confident woman he knew her to be. "Elijah," she began softly, closing the door behind her. "I'm sorry to drop by unannounced. I just needed someone to talk to. I needed you to talk to," he sighed, gesturing to the chair across from him. "Delilah, this is unexpected. What's on your mind?" She sat down, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I'm struggling, Elijah. This divorce, moving to a new town, trying to rebuild my life. It's all too much, and I feel so alone." Her voice cracked just enough to tug at his heartstrings. Elijah leaned back, clasping his hands together as he listened. He reminded himself of his role, her pastor, her guide, not her savior. "Delilah, I understand how difficult this must be for you," he said, his voice calm and measured. "But you're not alone. God is with you through it all, and the church community is here to support you." She looked at him, her gaze piercing. "And what about you, Elijah? You're not just a pastor to me. You're the one person who knows me, who understands me. I've been running from my feelings for so long, but I can't anymore." "Delilah," he warned, his tone firm but gentle. "We can't revisit the past. Whatever connection we had, it's over. I have a family, a calling." "I'm not asking for anything," she interrupted, her voice trembling. "I promise, Elijah, I'll leave you alone, but before I go, I need closure. I need just one thing." Elijah's guard was up, but his curiosity got the better of him. "What is it?" She hesitated, her eyes dropping to her hands folded in her lap. When she looked up, her expression was pleading. "A hug, just one hug, to help me let go." Every instinct told him to say no, to send her away, but the tears in her eyes, the raw vulnerability in her voice, chipped away at his resolve. He told himself it was harmless, a simple gesture of compassion. "Just a hug," he repeated, more to himself than to her. She nodded, standing as he rose reluctantly from his chair. They stepped toward each other, and when her arms wrapped around him, he felt the flood of memories he had fought so hard to bury. Her touch was warm, her scent intoxicatingly familiar. He told himself to pull away, but the moment stretched on, the boundary between comfort and danger dissolving. Then it happened. She tilted her head up, her lips inches from his. He could feel her breath, see the silent question in her eyes. And in a moment of weakness, he answered. Their lips met, the kiss igniting a fire he thought had long been extinguished. It was passionate, unrestrained, and utterly destructive. When they finally broke apart, the room was heavy with unspoken words and unacknowledged truths. Elijah stepped back, his chest heaving. "This was a mistake," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. But Delilah's expression was anything but regretful. A satisfied smile played on her lips as she replied, "Mistakes don't feel this right, Elijah." She gathered her things, leaving him standing there, shaken and guilt-ridden. As the door closed behind her, Elijah sank into his chair, his head in his hands. He had crossed a line he vowed never to approach again, and deep down, he knew there was no turning back. The storm was no longer on the horizon, it was here, and it was about to tear his world apart. This concludes part 1 of our story. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel so you'll be instantly notified when part 2 is released. In the next part, we'll uncover whether Pastor Elijah can find a way to escape the schemes of this cunning woman. Will he overcome the trials and restore his family? Can he continue his ministry despite Delilah's sinister presence? Or will he succumb to temptation and risk losing everything he's worked so hard to build? Find out the answers in part 2. See you there.